Chapter 22, Winds of Change, Part 3. One step closer to oblivion, I could only compare standing on what remained of the cliff to standing on the edge of the world. Not of our world, however, but rather a world of its own. Separated from the wonderland I loved and tried to protect, it was deprived of all hope, light, and goodness. As the air became heavy with nothingness, I felt alone and empty. It would have been far too easy to give in to the despair I felt here and walk off the cliff, letting the darkness I had battled for days now consume me, just as it would everything else. My heart stayed its course, knowing that this cliff would be the final destination on my journey to join Alice in the histories. The reality was that Griffin, along with so many others in this war, had fought valiantly but ultimately sacrificed their lives to ensure I reached it. I couldn't fail them after coming this far, so, here, on this fractured cliff, on the edge of the battlefield, I was going to come face to face with Wonderland's ultimate evil. I stumbled forward as a thick layer of smog crept in around my ankles. The colors of misery from across the way clung to my face. Wanting to keep the crystal rose from harm, as I inched forward in the dark, I took the shield off my back and let it lead my way. Useless as it was from the damage it had sustained earlier, it did its job well enough, but it couldn't block the voice of the enemy I had come to find. Well, just when we were beginning to wonder if you were going to show up, the King of Clubs said while stepping out of the shadows and clapping mockingly in false celebration. "Here I am," I called back in a cocky yet cold tone. The king turned his nose up at my reply. "Yes, well, as obvious as that is, you should know that I don't like to be kept waiting, especially when I'm on the verge of a victory such as this. Though it makes me wonder, what scheme was it that could possibly make you, the savior of Wonderland, abandon his people and leave them to fend for themselves like this?" My answer was quick and simple. "This," I said as I took the rose off my back and held it by the strap for him to see. What should have invoked fear, or concern at least, instead made the king chuckle, as if unimpressed. "The crystal rose. I should have known she would take part in my brother's cowardice. How is she able to convince you to go looking for a myth? She probably told you that it was the only hope Wonderland had for survival. That, with the power of the rose, she could destroy us, and you would all live in your perfect little kingdom forever after, didn't she? Well, I take no pleasure in telling you that you have been grossly misled, deceived even. You probably don't even know what that thing really does, do you?" Angered by my suggested incompetence, I fired back. "I know exactly what it does. The King of Diamonds himself told me its truth, and left no secret unspoken." The king's eyes grew wide as he got angry, as he too got angry. "Then you know that weapon will solve nothing and save no one. Yet you still bring it here to challenge me. We didn't want this, all this pain and suffering. We gave you a simple choice, and you handled it like a fool, willing to destroy everything rather than listen to reason. You are the fool for assuming that there is any other way than this, that there is a Wonderland left to have without White on the throne," I yelled, cutting him off. "She has no place on that throne," the king replied, resuming his anger. "She is weak, like her father, too just and loving to rule over these creatures with an iron fist like they need it. She has more right to the throne than you," I interrupted again. The king's anger was diluted to a snide hiss, had diluted to a snide hiss. "What did you say?" Before I could finish my thought, I was somehow able to spot the petite, gray figure of the White Queen out of the corner of my eye. Watching her struggle for every breath lit a fire inside me and brought to mind the conversations I had with both the King of Diamonds and Red. When I recalled what I needed, the words shot out of my mouth with a deadly force. The decision of kings. A choice that every true king must make. Your brother knew not only the sacrifice that needed to be made, but also when it was time to make it, for the good of Wonderland. White has made that choice as well. It is a choice that I have come to accept. These men are fighting for her because they accept it as well. We have no fear of death, for the good of Wonderland. It isn't your brother or your niece who are the weak ones for making this sacrifice. It's you, too full of fear to make it yourself when it needs to be done. You are no king of Wonderland and never will be." The king replied in his previous unimpressed tone. "You little worm, you speak of fear like you know it, understand it. How dare you preach it to me when it is the very thing I control?" Without warning, the king raised a hand to me and cast out a ball of pure dark magic. Thanks to quick reflexes, I was able to get my shield up in time to block. However, both the surprise of the attack and the force of it beating against my shield made it difficult to keep my balance. I held the crystal rose close to my chest and did my best to withstand the attack. This back and forth went on for a little while, with my defenses giving way little by little with each hit. Eventually, the King of Clubs got tired of toying with me, and seeing that this attack was ineffective, sought to rid me of my shield altogether. Putting his hands together, he called forth a massive energy ball that looked more like a small comet than anything else. As it traveled through the air and closed the distance between us, the head of the blast took the shape of a Jabberwocky's head with, excuse me, with a tail of black flame following behind. I knew I stood no chance of dodging or blocking this, so I ducked behind my shield as best I could and braced for the impact. I can't exactly recall what it felt like when I was hit, but I can tell you that I flew backwards and lost my grip on the crystal rose as the shield exploded into thousands of tiny fragments. Landing hard on my back, I took a second to gather myself and made sure that the rose rested safely on the ground next to me. When that was done, I drew the vorpal blade from my side and cautiously made it back to my feet. This foreground of the apocalypse is where the true battle for Wonderland would be contested. The scene of the King of Clubs and I standing on our respective ends of the cliffs, preparing to clash while the rest of the kingdom burned behind us, was something that will be forever ingrained in my mind. Here is where the end would come, one way or another. Heroes and villains aside, after this duel, Wonderland would be no more. I knew as I looked over at the unarmed king that I needed to be smart and keep a level head. Although I had overcome much in my journey, both to and from Wonderhaven, I knew that his power and skill couldn't be matched outright, and getting caught in just one mistake would prove fatal. I tried so hard to keep calm, but the longer I looked at him, the more I thought about what he had done to Hatter, what he had done to White as she lay on the cold ground between us. My patience began to fray and was rebuilt with rage. I couldn't allow him to strike first and grasp an advantage. The king needed to die. Blocking out all sounds of the storm above and all sights from the fight behind, I took off, charging at him with such speed and focus that I seemed to glide across the ground. The king made no effort to ready himself for my coming, not even a flinch. He only cracked half an intrigued smile as I leapt forward and sliced through him like butter. The oddity that I found this to be only escalated. The oddity that I found this to be only escalated when his body, instead of falling lifeless on the ground, instead vanished like an image on the water's surface. I knew it wouldn't be easy. He certainly wasn't going to be defeated with one swing of a sword. This was a trap. The king had used his dark magic to summon a decoy and disrupt my psyche. With haunting laughter, he reappeared to the left of me, and met the same fate. This too was a decoy, as were the forms that appeared to my right and then behind me. These antics continued until the king was sure he had worn me down enough to attack. With one last decoy to distract me, the real king took shape behind me and capitalized on the opening I had given him. To celebrate his trap prevailing, he conjured a long-handled warhammer out of the shadows. With a massive swing, the blunted end connected with my back, denting my armor around the blow with blown crushing force as it drove both the air from my lungs and me to the ground. As I lay stunned and unable to catch any reprieve for my sudden suffocation, I expected to feel the sharp pain of the hammer's large spike impaling my midsection. Instead of taking another swing, however, the king was patient, stalking me as I tried to squirm away. He stayed on my heels while I scratched and clawed my way through the dirt. Dragging my sword along with me, I found my way to my hands and knees, only to receive a stiff kick to the ribs. "Get up," the king yelled, as I returned to a heap. My attempt to do this was slow, as I was still trying to recover my breath from moments before. Face down in the dirt again, I found the motivation I needed when I thought of this as another wasted opportunity by the king to kill me. He only stood there, taunting me, waiting for me to get up. So with grunts of frustration and discomfort, I rose to meet his demand. I came to a crouched position, holding my sword tightly, and without warning, I bolted for the king, hoping that the sudden change of momentum would surprise him into making a critical mistake. My hope was in vain, however, because the king seemed prepared for even the most spontaneous attack. He kept pace with my furious strikes and blocked each one with an eerie composure while waiting for an opening. My onslaught went on, until he was able to stall it and push me backwards, allowing for enough space to swing his hammer. In one fluid motion, he swiped at my ankles, which I jumped over, and after spinning around, brought it to skull level, which I ducked under. Missing a two-handed attack like he did left him vulnerable, and I acted quickly to seize my chance. While he was unable to defend himself, I thrust my blade towards his chest. Of course, the king had a counter for this as well. Just as contact was made, he teleported and reappeared and sidestepped away with his hammer, loaded and ready for another swing. Before I could even comprehend what was happening, I took another hit in the ribs on my right side and was dropped to my knees instantly. I buckled in such quick fashion that the king couldn't get out of the way before catching me in a free arm. Limp and helpless as I was completely at his mercy, and found myself the recipient of an unforgiving headbutt that dropped me to the ground again. From my back, I looked up at the sky as it raged on and on. I wondered if one wrong move down here would cause the entire thing, in its infinite power, to come crashing down on us. Honestly, at that exact moment, I prayed for such an intervention. Unfortunately, my little daydream was interrupted by the sound of the vorpal blade being kicked out of my reach and sent near the edge of the cliff nearest the battle. The next thing I felt was a tight grasp around my neck, as I was lifted by my throat off the ground and held in the air. As I hung there choking, I saw the king's smile return to the corners of his mouth, before a burst of dark magic shot forth from his grip and blasted me backwards in the direction of my weapon. Smashing hard against the ground and skidding across the surface, I came to rest inches from rolling off to my doom. I laid there motionless, still too far away from my sword for it to be of any use. And there was the sky again. It was looking down on the fight with the ability to stop everything, but no matter how desperately I looked to it for aid, it did nothing but watch. This time my thoughts were disrupted by the king, who, leaping high into the air, lifted his hammer above his head and intended on coming down on top of me, driving the spiked end through my chest. Somehow, in the last possible second, I was able to roll out of harm's way, ending up behind the king as he came down and stuck the spike deep into the soil where my heart should have been. Continuing to act on reaction instead of thought, I was able to reunite with the vorpal blade, and chose to hit the king with a mighty aerial strike of my own, as he was distracted with the freeing of his spike. What I couldn't see from midair, however, was that he had already freed his hammer and was lying in wait for me to reach him. Just as I was about to come down on him, he turned around and swung. Bludgeoning my chest, the blow tossed me backward through the air a short distance before slamming me to the ground. For the third time in this clash, I was on my back, looking up at a sky that had no answers. This time was different. The breath that had been knocked out of my lungs wasn't coming back. The king's hammer had caused my breastplate to collapse tightly around my body, making it extremely difficult to take in air. I felt broken. It took a lot of effort to make the tiniest movements with my appendages. They were more like twitches. With some straining, I was able to run my fingertips over the hilt of my sword. Any further progress was halted when the king stood over me and placed a foot on my wrist to keep it still, out of reach. When he was convinced that I was done trying to reach for my sword, he released my wrist and placed his foot on my neck, forcing me to look at white. "Do you want to know what real fear is?" he asked in a hushed tone. "Look no further than the eyes of your queen as she struggles to keep herself back from the edge of morality. That is fear. I even sense it in you. You're too proud to admit it, but I feel it inside you. You're gasping for every breath, gasping for every speck of hope that slips through your fingers and drifts away into the darkness. You say that you have no fear of death, but that's only because you have yet to see its face." Taking his foot off of my neck, the king raised the spiked end of the hammer over his head before yelling, "I am death." This was it, the moment that I had managed to outrun whenever I encountered it on this adventure. I knew that I was caught, and there was nothing I could do to prolong nor prevent the hammer coming down to deliver its fatal blow. So, I did the only thing that was still within my power to do. I closed my eyes, held in what breath I could take, and made my peace. However, where I had given up, an observant sky above must have seen enough, breaking its silence and coming alive just as my execution was about to be carried out. Breaking the silence and coming alive just as my execution was about to be carried out, it sent a bolt of lightning straight down to the spike. It struck with such intensity that it severed the spike from the rest of the hammer before traveling down into the king's arm. With beast-like screams, the king dissolved into his smoky form and frantically retreated to his respective corner of the cliff. During this time and separation that I had just been bought, I knew I needed to somehow make it back to my feet before he turned his attention back to me. Through great pain and anguish, I battled to pick myself up, but was barely successful in picking up my head from where it lay. It was difficult to move, it was as difficult to move as it was to breathe, and the longer I tried, the more hopeless it felt. That was until I felt a gentle yet sturdy breeze shiver down my neck. It was as though the sky had sprouted hands and was attempting to lift my dead weight back to my feet. Recognizing this help, I dug deep, and while groaning, I got myself first to a sitting position, then to a kneeling one. Amazingly, I was still alive and upright, but in no condition to fight. My armor had sadly become nothing more than a useless hindrance to me now, and as risky as it was to remove it and continue unprotected, it was the only way. The breeze helped me lift my breastplate over my head and held me while I removed my gauntlets. Soon, with nothing but a thin shirt between my skin and harm, I was able to breathe and move a little more naturally. Unsteadily, I picked up the vorpal blade and came across the burnt spike laying on the ground, not too far away. Figuring that it may come in handy, I secretly picked it up and hid it behind me before the king could notice. I then staggered to my feet, weak but ready for the next move. The king, having regained most of his humanity, and who was showing obvious signs of injury from the lightning bolt, appeared to be sadistically happy with the sight of my armor being discarded. "That's it, fight me like a man," he hissed, black smoke still swirling around him. "You know you could be a king after all. You can talk like one, you have the fighting spirit of one, and you might even have the look of one. But no more tricks, no more magic. Let's see if you die like one." Suddenly, the next phase in our fight was signified by a mechanical transformation. With the simple gesture of pounding the ground, the king's hammer underwent a dramatic change. Starting from the bottom, the handle extended in length a great deal. Next, the head of the hammer separated to reveal a sizable spike rising from the center. Soon after, 4 more sprouted up from that and came to rest, with 2 on each side. When all was said and done, the weapon that came to be was a 5-pronged trident, with points that looked as though they had been crudely formed from glass. The evolution now complete, the king initiated an attack, lunging at me and meeting in the center of the cliff. The closing moments came quick, but passed quicker. They began with the 2 of us engaging in brief but heavy combat. The momentum appeared to have sided with me, as I was able to push the king back onto his end. Keeping him on the cliff, it seemed the upper hand was firmly in my grasp. That was until I used the vorpal blade to block a direct shot from the trident. All progress was stopped when my sword became lodged between 2 of the prongs. Then it became a power struggle to see who would be the first to free their weapon. Each push of the trident made me lose footing and slide backward as the spearheads crept closer and closer to impaling me. Trying to hold my place put tremendous tension on the vorpal blade, and it began to weaken. The longer the struggle went on, the more it gave in, until it eventually snapped in 2 from the pressure. In shock, I watched as the upper part of the blade went soaring from existence, tumbling to the ground below. As concerning as this was for my chances, I couldn't let it affect me. I still possessed the bottom half of the sword, and there was still an obstacle to overcome. Seeing me hold the fractured blade, the king foolishly assumed that I had no strategy left to combat him. "This is over," he yelled impatiently, just before testing me with a series of thrusts and swipes. Making no attempts to block, I instead focused on dodging this tantrum until an opening presented itself. Withstanding the onslaught with only decently sized laceration on my shoulders and ribs, that moment came in the form of a clean duck under the trident. What followed was purely reactionary, getting in close enough to strike him with the spike I stole earlier. Sticking it deep into his side, his obvious staggering was coupled with a long gasp of both surprise and dread, bringing down his guard. Bringing down his guard, I followed up my attack by plunging what remained of the vorpal blade deep into his chest. Choking, the king released his grip on the trident, which disappeared before it could hit the ground. He stood still until he became too weak to hold himself up. Then, in a twist of irony, it was I who caught him in my arms, while he faintly whispered his last words from atop that lonely cliff. "I see you now, the man worthy of the legends, come to save the day once more. But you are too late. Too late. Just as I have failed in my mission, you have also. Your queen is gone. Your numbers are diminishing. Soon, you will be the only one left fighting. And for what? The darkness we have unleashed upon this place will hunt you, and when it comes, there will be no fighting it. No matter how pure your heart is, you will stand no chance. The hero is not meant to win here, but I think you know that already. That is what you're afraid of, isn't it? Embrace it, because it's the only thing you have left, Alan." The king's sentence ended abruptly as he pulled the vorpal blade from his chest, throwing himself from my arms and over the edge. I could do nothing to catch him, just watched him sink, lower and lower as his body became like a cloud, joining him to the storm he had created. That's going to wrap this episode up for us, guys. Bit of a longer one to make up for the last one, but definitely action-packed. And I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you in the next one.